Okay, welcome and good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining today's webinar, which will be focusing on heat networks. Um, so before we get started, just really wanted to let you know that this webinar will be recorded and access to the recording will be available shortly after the webinar has ended. There will be a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So please use the Q&A function of Zoom to raise questions for our speakers. We'll do our best to respond to as many questions as we can during the Q&A sessions, or we circulate answer responses afterwards the event. Also, just letting you know that there will be a short survey. We'll follow the webinar to get your feedback on the presentation. So this webinar is the third in a six-part webinar exploring how to overcome common barriers to net zero and public sector. The webinar series aims to explore strategies for reviewing net zero targets, exploring large renewable energy projects, and delivering investable place-based net zero projects too. So for those of you who are not familiar with us, the Carbon Trust is a mission-driven organization, and the mission is to accelerate the move to a decarbonized future. We were pioneers in this space, being in it for about 20 years or so, and we provide a range of services related to climate change, which I won't go over here. It's a bit too extensive. However, we work with a large number of businesses, governments, public bodies, and financial institutions over the years, both across the UK and globally. In terms of our team, the Citizen Regions teams, if you joined our previous webinars, you have heard about some of the other services we provide in renewables and so on. This particular webinar is delivered by the team, which focusing on heat networks. This team provided support to more than 70 heat network projects across the UK in a range of different areas that really spans from early energy master planning through to technical feasibilities, policy, commercial, and financial advice as well. So before we dive in, let me just quickly introduce today's speakers. I'm Akush Reves. I'm a senior manager here at the Carbon Trust, working on low carbon heating and cooling projects, specializing in heat networks. Joining me are my colleague, Sweti Petrova, who brings expertise in financial modeling of large energy infrastructure projects. And I also like to introduce our guest speaker, Kate Ashworth from the West Midlands Combined Authority. Unfortunately, Kate can be with us this morning, but she's very kindly recorded her presentation, which we'll be playing a bit later in the webinar. So here is a quick overview of what we'll cover today. We'll start with a short regulatory update, setting out where we are with the upcoming regulations of Ofgem, business, and some policy updates and timelines and so on. Then we'll look at the different roles local authorities and public sector organizations can take when it comes to developing new heat networks and some of the key considerations for those different categories and roles. From there, we'll zoom out to the regional level with the West Midlands Combined Authority sharing their experience of coordinating projects across multiple boroughs. So this is going to be the point where we'll be playing Kate's pre-recorded presentation. We then explore the funding landscape, covering some of the existing current live opportunities like HND, GHNF. So my colleague Sweti will talk about those in a bit more detail, as well as covering some other opportunities as well. And after that, we'll highlight a policy watch, what to keep an eye on as regulations are finalized. And then we'll finish with some practical next steps you can take now before wrapping up with a Q&A. So let's get started. Now, I'm sure most of you on this call have already heard a fair bit about the upcoming regulations. To be fair, it's been hard to miss in the last year or so how the sector is going through this massive transformation and change, becoming a regulated sector. So Ofgem will be the regulator for the heat networks across England, Wales, and Scotland. Regulations will focus on consumer protections, fair pricing, and will introduce also mandatory technical standards for both new and existing heat networks. So these are some of the main outcomes we can expect as the new regulatory framework comes into place. So first, demand assurance. One of the biggest challenges for heat networks has always been securing reliable anchor loads, big buildings with big chunky heat demands. So zoning and the introduction of mandatory connection requirements as part of the upcoming legislations will give developers and funders more certainty that demand will be there. Second, the standardized and accelerated development process. So we saw in many projects previously in the past that projects often had to reinvent the wheel on governance and procurements, really slowing down a process which is already quite long for developing large energy infrastructure projects. So the new statutory consent regime in England will bring consistency, making it easier for councils and developers to navigate that process. Third, fair and transparent costs to end consumers. So regulations will cover pricing and tariff methodologies, ensuring customers aren't exposed to hidden costs or poor value, bringing heat networks really in line with gas and electricity sectors. And finally, very importantly, improved quality of service. So with Ofgem as the regulator and the new Heat Network Technical Assurance Scheme, or HENTAS, setting minimum standards, customers will see better protections from reliability of supply through complaints handling and redress as well. So yeah, this is common questions we get asked. Am I going to be regulated by Ofgem? So the short answer is yes, if your organization owns or operates a heat network. That includes housing teams running communal systems or block of flats, or energy teams managing council-run networks. You also fall under regulations if you supply heat directly to end users, even if the charges are currently bundled into rent or service charges, which could be quite common in social landlord cases. So if that's the case, your organization will need to register with Ofgem and obtain authorization, comply with technical assurance under the Heat Network Technical Assurance Scheme, and meet new consumer protection duties, things like transparent billing, safeguards for vulnerable residents, and proper complaint handling procedures as well. So, but very importantly, if you are in doubt at all, the best advice is to seek legal and regulatory guidance ahead of 2026. So there are no surprises when the regime comes into force. We also thought it would be quite useful just to very quickly review the latest regulatory timeline. So a new consumer advice service supporting heat network consumers was already launched on the 1st of April 2025, which is great. The public now can visit Citizens Advice website for free, impartial advice and support. And individuals can also file their complaints with the Energy Ombudsman. In January 2026, heat network regulations officially commence. At that point, existing operators and suppliers will be deemed authorized initially, but must register with Ofgem by January 2027. One thing is worth highlighting that it's planned that Ofgem's digital service opens for registration in the spring of 2026. So effectively, you'd have the periods between the spring of 2026 and January 2027 to register your networks. Right, so now the next few slides will explore the different roles and interests that public sector organizations can have in heat network projects. So of course, not every organization would have the same interests and would take the same path. What's really important is understanding where you sit now, what role really makes sense for your organizations, and how that might evolve as regulations come into place. So Based on previous experience projects, we found that local authorities and public sector organizations tend to fall into 5 broad categories when it comes to heat networks. First, curious and exploring. So these organizations just about starting to look at heat networks, mapping out opportunities and understanding what really zoning and regulation might mean for them. The second category of role here is about anchor and enabler. So here, organizations aren't necessarily developing heat networks themselves, but are critical because of their estate, planning powers, or ability really to convene local institutions. The third category of role here is delivery partner. In this role, the authority makes a more active stake, perhaps as a joint venture partner, shareholder, or by providing lend or finance alongside a developer. The fourth one is about being a public-led developer. So some councils choose to lead development themselves, often through setting up an SPV or an arm's length vehicle organization, taking direct control and responsibility for delivery. And finally, the facilitator and oversight role. This is the strategic role, often linked to zoning, providing coordination, ensuring consumer standards are met, and overseeing delivery across multiple projects or even multiple boroughs as well. So on the next few slides, we'll dive into each of these roles in a bit more detail. For each, I'll share some of the key considerations and practical actions that public sector organizations might want to think about, whether that's making the most of their estate, working with partners, or shaping delivery models for heat network projects. The idea isn't really to put anyone in a fixed category, but to show the different ways organizations can contribute to heat network development and how those roles may shift as projects and local ambitions grow and evolve. So the very first one is the curious and exploring. This is where many public sector organizations start out and just really beginning to explore what heat networks are and what role they might play locally. At this stage, is less about committing to delivery and more about building knowledge and awareness locally within the local teams. A really useful first step is to map your estate and potential anchor loads. So things like schools, leisure centers, depots, or housing stock can often form the backbone of viable heat network schemes. So even a simple GIS mapping exercise can really help show where the biggest opportunities might lie in your local areas. It also makes a big difference to raise awareness internally. So heat networks, as I mentioned before, massive, large energy infrastructure projects can really cut across many different departments, including planning, housing, finance, estates, legal. So if these colleagues are not engaged early, project can really stall later on. We saw this in the past. So just really starting the conversation now really ensures that those colleagues are aware of what's coming and can really factor it into their own plans as well, which is, beneficial for everyone. So, and finally, keeping an eye on funding and support opportunities. So again, this is something that my colleagues very well cover in a bit more detail later, but things like HNDU, the Green Heat Network Fund, or any sort of regional programs. Even if you are not in a position to ready to bid today, being aware of what's available means you'll be better placed to act when the time is actually right for you and for your project. For some organization, again, we saw that there's a difference between an idea sitting on the shelf and the project actually being moving forward. So yeah, it's a really important consideration. The next role, so this role is less about delivering a heat network yourself and more about creating the conditions that make one possible. So this is the role about being an anchor and enabler. So the most obvious way you can do this is through your estate and land. Public buildings often provide the critical demand that makes projects stack up financially. Councils can also use land ownership or planning powers to safeguard energy centers, sites, or pipe corridors, and so on. So you can also play a powerful convening role as well. So by engaging local institutions, for example, like NHS trusts, universities, or housing providers, can really help align demand and give developers the confidence that a viable customer base will be there in future. So yeah, let's move to the next one. So another important step is to align retrofit cycles with heat network opportunities. So if a school or housing block is, for example, do a boiler replacement in 5 years, it makes sense to see whether that could be conceived with a potential heat network connection. So being an anchor and enabler isn't a passive role. It's about using the tools you already have to unlock opportunities and give projects the best chance to succeed. In some cases, organizations want to take a more active role in delivery, becoming an actual delivery partner in a project. So this might mean being a minority shareholder in a special purpose vehicle, for example, entering into a joint venture with a private partner, or providing capital, lend, or some guarantees to have the scheme progress, securing some kind of equity later on. So the big advantage is that you get more influence over how the project is run, but with that comes the need for strong governance and oversight as well. So contracts and shareholder agreements should be spelled out how the organization is kept informed and what levers it has if things actually don't go to plan. Another key point is about reputation in here. So even if a private partner is doing most of the heavy lifting, the public will usually associate the network with the public sector delivery partner. That means you need confidence that tariffs, service quality, and delivery standards really reflect well on you. So being a delivery partner can be a good balance. You are not carrying all the risk of direct delivery, but you do have a stake and voice in shaping the project outcomes. The final role is less about delivery and more about strategic leadership and coordination. So some organizations, particularly combined authorities or larger councils, act as a facilitator or overseers multiple projects. That means aligning heat network development with planning, housing, regeneration, net zero strategies, rather than focusing on a single scheme development. It can also mean supporting coordinating across boundaries, working with neighboring councils or regional partners to make sure projects join up and opportunities aren't missed. Another part of this role is stakeholder engagement and community engagement. Is a really important role, as heat networks are long-term infrastructure and their success really depends on trust. Having a public body provide oversight helps really ensure that projects serve local needs, not just purely commercial interests. So while this role may feel less hands-on, it's often one of the most influential one in practice, shaping the big picture, setting expectations, and providing confidence that heat networks are being delivered in the public interest. So as you can see, these roles represent different entry points into heat network development. And as this final example shows, often these roles don't exist in isolations. Projects often cut across boundaries and require coordination at a bigger scale. A great example of this is in the West Midlands, where the Combined Authority has been working with local councils to coordinate heat network delivery across the region. To share their experience, I'm very pleased to hand over to our guest speaker, Kate Ashworth from the West Midlands Combined Authority, who's kindly recorded a presentation for us, so it's not a real handover. In fact, I'm just going to play Kate's presentations, but if you have any questions to Kate after this, we can pass on your questions back to her and share those with you later. So let's now move on to Kate's presentation.
Hi, I'm Kate Ashworth. I'm the Head of Energy Infrastructure, Energy Capital, part of the West Midlands Combined Authority. I've been asked to share a short presentation on our experience of trying to bring forward heat networks at scale in our region. Firstly, I just want to say that we have a great enthusiasm for heat networks in our region and see their coordinated development as a critical enabler for ambitious, inclusive growth that we're looking to drive in our region. At a strategic level, the West Midlands is looking to support the development of large-scale and connectable heat networks, which will form a spine network across our region, linking large-scale heat sources, including energy from waste, data centres, and waste heat sources from industrial hub, with heat demand across our cities and regions. There's a really strong strategic alignment between the government's ambitions for heat network and what we can deliver specifically in our region. Most critically, we have a predominantly urban environment with lots of heat demand density. The fact that we have 2 cities in the advanced zoning pilots, where our local authority partners and industry specialist consultants are gaining really great insights about how to roll out heat network zoning, where existing schemes already exist. And the fact that we have a net zero devolution deal with the government, which includes funding for the internal works for heat network connections. So what are we trying to get out of heat networks in our region? Well, heat networks can offer decarbonisation potential and bring investment into our regions passively. But to ensure that they deliver this in an optimal and inclusive way, we really do need a proactive approach. And this can be facilitated by regional support and cooperation for zone coordination. Really, what we're trying to get out of them is to support our decarbonisation objectives. So we've set ourselves a 2041 net zero target and declared a climate emergency, as many others have. Really, we want to ensure a fair heat price for reliable heat. So making sure that both from a domestic and commercial point of view, we're helping to alleviate fuel poverty and avoid high business energy costs. We're acutely aware that heat networks deliver a monopoly service, and therefore we need to be very, very careful when it comes to consumer protection in this space. We also want to help drive inclusive growth for investment in our region. So making sure that we think of heat networks as really an enabler for that. And fourthly, we want to integrate with and support the delivery of multi-vector energy systems. So not just thinking about heat and heat decarbonisation, but also thinking about all the other energy infrastructure elements that could be included within those commercial models that really help deliver the first 3 of those objectives. We know in order to drive the outcomes that we seek, we will need to ensure that we're working collaboratively across regional and local government, and really proactively with the market also. The value of working in this way includes being able to bring forward larger cross-boundary schemes. We really want to understand multi-vector impacts and opportunities, such as how heat networks align and connect with the grid. We want to ensure that inclusive growth and social value is at the heart of the design and implementation of heat networks. So Energy Capital, as I say, part of the West Midlands Combined Authority, we have built, with specialist technical and commercial advice, a programme business case for the wider facilitative functions that would unlock these benefits. We've looked to demonstrate the importance of investing in robust data foundations, for example. We believe we need resource to be able to make those cross-linkages across large-scale programmes and make sure that we don't lose the local benefits in the producer scale. And lastly, we need really strong programme management to support and ensure effective delivery. Understanding and mitigating risks of the rollout will be critical to ensuring the success that we think heat networks can be in our area. The elephant in the room is that we haven't secured these resources yet, but we are working on it. We can see that with a small but mighty team, we can make a huge impact. We can see that heat network zoning will give local government levers to designate and procure delivery partners for zones, which will unlock great swathes of potential. And we really want to harness that, ensure that we achieve the aims that we set out. If anyone would like to compare notes on how we can do that, my contact details on the final slide. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much for your time. Hi.
Thanks very much to Kate for sharing the experience of the West Midlands Combined Authority. It's a really good reminder for us all on how important regional coordination is in making these projects happen. And building up on that, I would like to turn to the funding landscape and look at the support that is currently available for public sector organizations. But before we go into funding, I would like to introduce the heat network development stages, as most of the funding is tied to a specific stage and the activities in it. So the first stage in heat network development is feasibility. Here, the aim is to assess whether a heat network is viable for a particular area or an estate. This is typically done through initial technical modeling and some basic financial analysis, identification of the heat sources and the potential customers for the heat network, and very high level route planning and demand assessment. Feasibility concludes with a report that outlines the potential benefits of the heat network, any risks, and the next steps. And with that, the heat network moves on to the second stage, the so-called DPD, or detailed project development stage, which refines the concept further and prepares the stage for investment. This is done through activities such as a detailed engineering design and energy modeling of the heat network. Stakeholder engagement is very important at this stage. Customer sign up is done through letters of intent. So no contracts are signed up yet, but the main customers are identified. And detailed commercial and financial analysis is performed to support decision-making in finding the right structures for the heat network. The DPD stage concludes with an outlined business case and technical design that is ready for procurement and funding. With that, the heat network moves on to the commercialization stage, where it basically secures funding and finalizes the contractual agreements. During this stage, commercial structures are finalized, investments and grants are secured, and contracts with suppliers and customers are drafted and actually signed. Commercialization typically ends with a financial close and a contractual readiness for construction. And then the heat network moves into the last stage, which is delivery. This is where the heat network is actually built and commissioned. During this stage, the construction occurs, followed by testing, commissioning, operational setup, and customer or onboarding. The outcome is a functional heat network, hopefully delivering low carbon heat. With this in mind, with the 4 stages of heat network development, we will move on to the funding landscape and talk about what funding is currently available through the 4 stages of heat network development. So firstly, the Heat Networks Delivery Unit, or HNDU, provides grant funding and guidance for the early stages of heat network development, including feasibility and detailed project development, which are the first 2 stages of heat network development. In feasibility, the HNDU grant covers techno-economic assessment, legal, financial, and commercial viability analysis. In DPD, the funding supports delivery model selection, stakeholder engagement, and procurement strategy planning. HNDU also provides funding for project management support and covers externally procured project management resources, including guidance on zoning, carbon savings, and strategic alignment of the heat network. In general, there is up to 100,000 available per project, with exceptions considered for the larger heat networks. 100% of eligible external costs are covered by the grant. Importantly, HNDU round 15 is now open. Expressions of interest are due by the end of this week, by the 12th of September, and the full application due by the 20th of October. Again, this is funding for early stage project development for things like feasibility studies, master planning, commercial preparation, in order to get the project to a point where they can access capital independently. Next is the Green Heat Networks Fund, which launched in 2022 and supports commercialization and construction of heat networks in England. So whereas HNDU covers the first two stages of a heat networks development, GHNF covers the last two. It includes all of commercialization costs, so all of the third stage of the heat network development, and in theory, up to 50% of construction costs. However, recently that number has been closer to 30% as the grant scheme has become very competitive. It applies to new heating and cooling networks, retrofitting and expansion of existing heat networks. The grant is managed and supported by Triple Point, who offer guidance with the application and one-to-one support by appointing a relationship manager for each project. Round 10 of GHNF is also now open, with applications closing on the 7th of November. Then this is capital funding for heat networks. So if HNDU helps the schemes get off the ground, GHNF is really about the later stages of developing a heat network. Next, the Public Sector Decarbonization Scheme, or PSDS, which has now unfortunately been closed with no further rounds being planned. This is important because many of the GHNF projects had previously relied on PSDS to cover the internal retrofit costs of anchor buildings for heat network. And we will just have to keep an eye on what the government may decide going forward as a replacement. Next, the National Wealth Fund is actually expanding its offer for heat networks, which today includes an early stage debt to reduce project risk, offering deferring payments until revenues are stable. And also the National Wealth Fund now offers patient equity, which makes projects more investable. Patient equity is a form of capital invested with a longer term time horizon, and thus allowing projects more time and the time they need to grow and succeed. In this case, the National Wealth Fund invests alongside a private investor in a heat network with a more flexible exit timeline and receives no dividend on their equity stake until the other investor has achieved their target IRR. In addition, the National Wealth Fund also offers advisory services to support local authorities and their partners in deciding on commercial models. In Scotland, overall, the situation is similar, with the Heat Network Support Unit continuing to provide revenue funding for early stage work. It covers expansion of existing heat networks and new heat networks in a way similar to that of HNDU funding in England. Pre-capital support provided covers up to 100% of feasibility costs and 50% of the costs associated with drafting an outline business case. Funding is currently available until March 2026, and it comes with a critical friend support as well as money. The Scotland Heat Networks Fund, which is similar to GHNF, is a 300 million capital grant scheme launched by the Scottish Government to support heat networks and to fund the later stages of their development. You can currently submit an expression of interest, and if successful, you will be invited to submit an application form. So unlike England, there are no rounds and no deadlines. You can submit an expression of interest at any point in time. In Wales, the situation is slightly different. there is no grant specifically targeted to heat networks. There is funding for heat networks, however, available via the Welsh Government Decarbonisation Project Design and Development Grant, which is currently open as well and accepting applications. The grant provides support for a wider variety of decarbonisation projects and not just heat networks. Heat networks are just one of them, which is an approach that has its advantages. But as far as heat networks are concerned, this is not a grant that exclusively supports them like the ones in England and Scotland. Overall, there's a strong mix of opportunities, but also some gaps, particularly in Wales and around the PSDS replacement. With that, we'll move on to the next topic, which is a policy watch. So firstly, a quick reminder on geography. Some of what we talked about today, especially zoning, is specific to England. The DESNZ consultation response later this year will set out the statutory framework for zoning and will cover consent, zone coordinators, and building connection requirements. But other elements apply across the whole of Great Britain. So Ofgem, for example, will regulate heat networks in England, Scotland, and Wales, including consumer protection rules, tariff transparency, and complaints. And the heat network technical assurance scheme that Ankur spoke about will be phased in over time once policy proposals are finalized. This is just to make sure that the sector has sufficient time to understand and comply with the scheme. The shifts in funding are an important development worth watching, as the government wants to try to facilitate the transition to a more privately funded heat network space with the withdrawal of PSDS and the expansion of the National Wealth Fund offer, which is meant to encourage private investment in heat networks. And finally, in Northern Ireland, the Department for the Economy is working on its own regulatory framework. The focus there is on protecting consumers, introducing technical standards, and supporting market growth. So while the timelines are different, the direction of travel is very similar. Overall, zoning is an England-specific policy lever, but the wider regulatory shift, including consumer protections, technical standards, and assurance, is UK-wide. Maybe before we move on, I would like to flag that the first iteration of guidance on heat network consumer protection was published last week by Ofgem, and encourage you to read the consultations and respond if appropriate. With that, we'll move into the next page to finish today's webinar. Here we put together some very practical actions that you can take. Your role against the use cases we talked about earlier today. Are you an enabler, an anchor, or do you see yourself as a developer or future coordinator? Audit your estate, identify anchor loads, and think about retrofit cycles and contract readiness. If you own or operate any kind of network, including communal systems in housing blocks, you must now register with the Energy Ombudsman, which became mandatory in April. If you are a heat network operator, Ofgem are looking for participants to test the new digital service before it goes live. If you would like to take part, email them. Engage internally. The heat network agenda cuts across housing planning, finance, and legal, so make sure they're all in the loop. Track policy updates, including the DESNZ consultation response this autumn, Ofgem's consumer standards, and the rollout of HNTAS, because all of them will shape what comes next. And finally, look for funding. HNU round 15 and GHNF round 10 in England are both open at the moment. Funding is also available in Scotland and in Wales. If you have projects in the pipeline, this is a very good time to start preparing your bids. And with that, I'd like to hand it back to Akos for closing remarks before we go into Q&A.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Swati, for taking us through of the funding landscape for heat networks. So before we move into questions, let me just very quickly wrap things up a bit. So we covered quite a lot today, from emerging regulatory framework and different roles and inspirations local authorities and public sector organizations might take, through to the importance of being a regional coordinator, and finally the current funding and landscape as well. That's what he just covered. So yeah, quite a bit. The key takeaway is that policy and regulations are still evolving. The roles, obligations, and governance structures we discussed today may change as business and Ofgem finalize the statutory framework. But the direction of travel, I think, is clear. Heat networks are becoming a regulated utility, and public sector organizations will have a central role in making them a success. So what matters now is preparation, as we highlighted. So mapping your role, auditing your estate, engaging colleagues across departments, and acting on the funding opportunities that are open today, really, for the future. So I hope this session has given you a clear sense of both the opportunities and the practical steps you can take in this area. And with that, let's open it up to questions. We'll do our best to answer what we can, and anything we can't cover live, we'll follow up after the events. Just also letting you know that we'll be sharing both the recording and the slides after the event. So I'll hand over to my colleague Melanie, who'll be facilitating the Q&A.
Thanks, Akos, and thanks, Sveti, for your webinar. To start us off, we've got a few questions, but I'm going to start off with, are heat networks really the best option for net zero? Wouldn't it be simpler or less expensive to just electrify buildings with heat pumps?
Okay, I'm happy to take that one. So yeah, that's a fair question. Yeah, heat networks are not necessarily the silver bullet. Yeah, absolutely. Because yeah, every area, local area is different. So heat networks typically work very well and can be really economic and be able to provide low carbon heating to locals if you have a high heat demand density in your neighborhood, and also if you have some low carbon low cost energy sources as well. For example, energy from waste or excess heat from data centers or even rivers and so on. So the combination of these two things, so high heat demand density and locally available large-scale heat sources, if you combine these two, that typically can provide you with a really efficient heat network that can compete with individual big heat pump systems. So yes, it's not necessarily a silver bullet. You've got to do a bit of homework. You've got to do a bit of investigation. That's why we said during our webinar, is one of the first initial steps that you can do, practical step that you can do, is just to really do some initial mapping out these opportunities. And then that's what he highlighted. There are some funding is available through HNU as well that can support exactly these kind of activities. So yeah, hope that answered the question.
Great, thanks, Akos. Next question, and I'm sure this is probably felt by a lot of people. Do you know if there will be a replacement for PSDS?
Swati, would you like to cover
Sure. That? Yes. I think at the moment we don't know that there will be a replacement for PSDS, I think the working assumption is that they're at least in the short to medium term, we do not expect a replacement for PSDS. Longer term, we think, and I think a lot of people in the industry think that the government has to have a plan B, because there are costs associated with retrofitting buildings, for example, that have to be covered by support. I think the government have been, in the short term, we should not expect anything to replace the PSDS funding.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think as part of the Warm Homes program from the government, that's something that's probably worth keeping an eye on, because I think there's some anticipation that might be under that program that will be some form of solution or replacement for PSDS, very likely to be linked to retrofitting public sector buildings. But yeah, well, just for now, we just have to wait and see.
Thanks. Okay, we've got another question that says, would self-supply heat networks need to register to Ofgem too? And if so, does the same timescale apply?
To the best of my knowledge, yes. If you supplying heat to end users, yes, the short answer is yes. Quite recently, I think it was on the 8th of August, Ofgem published a consultation response covering some aspects around this. So I would really encourage the person who has the question just to go on Ofgem website. If you put in heat network consultations Ofgem, then you see all the latest publications and links to recently published consultation responses as well. So just make sure, to double check, what's in there. And again, if you have any doubt about whether if you're going to be regulated or not, just make sure you reach out to Ofgem and seek some advice, ASAP, as we're closely approaching to 2026.
Thank you. There was a question that says, oops, I've lost it. Is there a further grant for Wales? The one on the slide closes today. Actually, I think there was a typo on that slide, and it is not the 10th of September, but the 10th of October. So hopefully that will answer your question, and you still have a chance to get to that grant.
Yes. Can I just quickly say, first of all, apologies for the typo, and thank you, Melanie, for clarifying. With regards to heat networks, I don't believe there is a further grant in Wales. However, there is an additional grant in Wales that covers heating, but not as part of heat networks. So I think we would be happy to take that question offline and provide you with further details. You can get in touch with us.
Okay, another question, probably for you, Sveti. In terms of heat networks funding, how are projects funded outside of grants? So do you have any examples you could share with us?
So outside of grants, okay, so typically a heat network which is very profitable is unlikely to receive a GHNF grant. If it does need funding, then, and we see that with a lot of the heat networks, they get roughly 30% of CapEx or 30% of construction costs paid for by a grant from the Green Heat Networks Fund. The rest, it really depends. Funding ranges from council reserves, so some councils want to participate in a heat network and they use out their own reserves to fund part of the heat network, where others are happy to hand it off to a heat network developer. I would say in summary, there's a lot of flexibility from private funding to using council reserves to acquire a stake and finance the project.
Great, thank you, Sveti. Another question, maybe for Akash, what commercial delivery models options are typically available to the public sector?
Yeah, so I think at a high level, we covered the some of the considerations, I think, in today's presentation. So, but just again to recap things, traditionally there have been mostly three main models for heat network delivery. That's included public-led model, where the council, the organization, owns the assets, often via an SPV or an arm's length company. The second option is typically a joint venture, JV partnership, where the authority takes stake in, again, a special purpose vehicle with a private partner, but in that case, be sharing risks, but also, you can influence the direction of the project a bit more. And the third traditional model was about the concession private-led type model, where a private ESCO develops and operates the network under a long-term contract. I think it's worth highlighting that more recently, the AZP program, so the Advanced Zoning Program, piloted more standardized variants of these models to give local authorities a bit more structured choices. So they piloted these three new-ish models, which they named the development agreement only, where the council really appoints a developer and completely steps back after the financial close of the project. The second one they tested was the development agreement plus a Gordon share, where through the Gordon share, the council retains some limited governance rights without investing. And the third option that they tested under the AZP was the development agreement and co-investment model, where the council takes a minority equity stake, and I think typically up to about 20% for greater influence for the project. I think looking ahead, these models will need to adapt under the new business statutory zoning framework, where a new consent regime, as Tweety highlighted, will replace some existing contractual arrangements. But I think the fundamentals won't really change. Public sector organizations will still need to weigh really how much control risks and want to take on, and the investments they want to make into a project. So yeah, it's a lot to consider. It's a quite complicated, can be quite complicated, and to figure out like what works best for you. It's maybe worth highlighting that as the Carbon Trust Heat Networks team, we will be soon launching a new training, which actually specifically focusing on commercial financial considerations and advice for local authorities. So if that's something that you want to explore in a bit more detail, please feel free to reach out after this event, and we could send you some details on that upcoming training.
Thanks, Akash. I think we've got time maybe for one more question. What is the lead time from feasibility to implementation for a heat network?
Tweety, would you like to?
Sure. So I would say that they go through the 4 stages of heat network development. Feasibility, which is the first stage, I would say typically takes 3 to 6 months. It's in my mind, it's like the most straightforward and the shortest phase. Then moving on to the DPD, because in a way refines the information in feasibility, adding onto it commercial and financial modeling. So DPD typically takes 6 months. Then commercialization, it really depends, I would say, depends on how big, small, or complicated the heat network is, but it also depends on the model being chosen. However, just as a range, just as a guideline, commercialization, I would say, typically takes from 6 months for a very straightforward heat network to typically a year. I think for some of the huge heat networks out there, like the Swan, for example, in Westminster, it would take more than a year, but typically 6 months to a year. And then delivery, which is construction of the heat network, also like depending on its size, but I would say typically a year as well.
Excellent. So I think that was the time for the Q&A, if I'm correct, Melanie. Just looking at the time, we got just only a couple of minutes left before the webinar close. So before we wrap up, I just wanted to flag our next webinar, which is titled Overcoming Common Obstacles in Public Sector Renewable Energy Projects. It's happening on Wednesday, the 17th of September, same time at 9:30 a.m. And this session will look at the wider renewable energy delivery changes across the public sector. So if this is relevant to you, your organizations, your colleagues, please do register and join us using the link that's on this slide, or you can also use the barcode, which is in the top right corner. So that was all. With that, I'll bring today's webinar to close. Thank you so much once again for attending, and wishing you all the very best. Thank you.